Blacks meant to win by legal means. Whites by any means.
What if I told you there was a chapter of hidden American history, a brutal struggle for power and dominance that has been deliberately forgotten and omitted from our textbooks? In fact, in the not too distant past, if you went to the local library where this event happened to ask for information on the event, you were questioned on why you wanted to see it and or not allowed to see the information.
For a long time, if you went to the library in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was one thing you weren't allowed to research.
We were refused. We were rejected by the librarian.
When I asked about or inquired about 1898, they wanted to know why.
I was told that, yes, they had something, but they kept it under lock and key.
This was a day of violence and deception that reshaped the course of a city and the nation itself. And today, we illuminate the shadows of this hidden American history. So stay tuned to learn about the only successful coup in U.S. history.
Security for the presidential inauguration has increased after the events of January 6th. On that day, supporters of President Trump stormed the Capitol building and 5 people lost their lives. It's an event that brought the 1898 Wilmington massacre into the national spotlight. A day when white supremacists overthrew the existing city government and killed dozens of black leaders. WECT's John Smith.
In the late 19th century, North Carolina was undergoing political and social changes after the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. A coalition of white and black politicians, known as the Fusionists, won control of the state government and enacted reforms that benefited the black population.
There was an unusual degree of black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899.
Such as free education, debt relief, and equal rights. The Fusionists were a coalition of white and black Republicans and populists that won in the North Carolina state elections of 1894 and 1896 that led to the biracially led government in that state. Some of these Fusionist reforms were: 1. A more liberal election law that made it easier for North Carolinians to vote and ensured fair representation of all political parties at the polls. 2. A restoration of home rule that allowed local elections of officials in several eastern North Carolina counties where they had previously been appointed by the state. And 3. A progressive agenda that emphasized public educational reform and enhancement.
The day wages for everyone working in the community was higher than anywhere else in the state. African Americans had businesses from real estate through to attorneys and teachers, and every level of society was prospering for African Americans in Wilmington.
But the white supremacists, who were mostly Democrats, resented the Fusionists and their policies.
A multiracial government wasn't just a disappointment for Democrats. It was more like a humiliation.
They launched a campaign of propaganda, intimidation, and violence to undermine the biracial government and restore white supremacy.
When the Confederacy lost the Civil War to the Union, this ain't talked about a lot. But when they lost, the fury that came out of that loss was fueled by the fact that they lost to black soldiers. Remember, up until blacks enlisting in the Civil War, the Union was losing to the Confederacy. The Mason-Dixon line runs through Pennsylvania. That's how far north the South had pushed. It was blacks who beat the Confederacy, not whites, not Abraham Lincoln. It was blacks who defeated the South. That is what fueled the hatred of the Southern white man for the black man more than it had ever been fueled before. I didn't lose to Abraham Lincoln's army. I lost to my own slaves.
They used newspapers, speeches, and rallies to spread racist lies and fear among the white population, such as accusing black men of raping white women and threatening to take over the state. All this propaganda led the white population to accept, without challenge, these racist lies and to act as the Democrats wanted them to against the black population in a city that up to then had a thriving biracial community where black people and white people coexisted peacefully. In 1898, a state election was held that pitted the Fusionists against the Democrats. The Democrats used fraud, bribery, and violence to suppress the black vote and win the election. However, in Wilmington, the Fusionists still had a majority in the city council and the mayor's office. So, the Democrats decided to use Wilmington, North Carolina as an example of what they would do to any city that resisted their rule. Therefore, on November 10, 1898, a mob of about 2,000 armed white men marched into Wilmington. The armed white men were mostly the red shirts, which were the armed wing of the Democratic Party. The red shirts used violence, intimidation, and fraud to suppress the black vote and to influence the outcome of the 1898 elections. They also participated in the coup and massacre that overthrew the biracial government of Wilmington on November 10, 1898.
This is the story of an American election, but also of something we don't usually find in American history: the violent overthrow of a democratically elected government.
During this coup, the Democrats in red shirts burned down the offices of the Wilmington Daily Record, the only black newspaper in the city. They then went on a rampage through the black neighborhoods, killing an estimated 60 to more than 300 people. They also forced the elected mayor, alderman, and police chief to resign at gunpoint and replace them with Democrats.
At City Hall, the mayor and board of aldermen were forced out.
There's 200 armed men in City Hall at the time. They didn't do it of their own free will. And as they resigned, a new member selected by the Democratic Party was voted into office.
Basically, the red shirts were part of a larger movement of white supremacy that sought to reverse the gains made by African Americans during Reconstruction and impose racial segregation and disenfranchisement throughout the South.
The state Democratic Party handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it."
Once the Wilmington insurrection ended, the city was declared redeemed from black rule. Redeemed? As in liberated? As if the black population had been oppressing white people in Wilmington? My subscribers know what I'm going to say now. Bullshit. Some of the key figures involved in this coup, known as the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, were Josephus Daniels, the editor of the Raleigh News and Observer, who used his newspaper to spread racist propaganda and incite white anger against the Fusionist government and the black community. He was one of the main architects of the white supremacist campaign that led to the coup.
Their most effective tool was the media. One of North Carolina's biggest newspapers was a Democratic Party mouthpiece. It ran racist political cartoons throughout 1898.
Not everybody was literate in 1898, but to see a political cartoon of the type that ran, you may not be able to read it, but you know exactly what it means.
Many of the cartoons were centered on the threat of Negro rule, even though the Fusion government was mostly white.
Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer and a Democratic politician who led the mob that stormed into Wilmington and became the mayor after forcing the Fusionist officials to resign. He was also a prominent speaker at the white supremacist rallies and meetings. Alex Manley, the owner and editor of the Wilmington Daily Record, the only black newspaper in the state. He wrote an editorial that challenged the white supremacist narrative of black men as rapists and defended the rights of black people. His editorial was used as a pretext by the white supremacists to attack his newspaper and his person. He managed to escape from Wilmington during the coup. He left behind his company, which was burned to the ground, never to return to Wilmington. Daniel L. Russell, the governor of North Carolina from 1897 to 1901, who was a member of the Fusionist Coalition. He was a white Republican who supported the rights of black people and opposed the white supremacist agenda. He was unable to stop the coup or protect the victims, as he had no control over the state militia and faced opposition from the state legislature and the federal government. And Thomas C. Miller, a black businessman and alderman who was one of the leaders of the Fusionist government in Wilmington. He was a successful barber, real estate owner, and alderman. He was targeted by the white supremacists for his wealth and influence. He was forced to flee from Wilmington during the coup, leaving behind his properties and businesses. The Wilmington Insurrection of 1898 was not only a coup and a massacre, but also a catalyst for a wave of racial oppression and violence across the South.
Sent to the church was the Wilmington Light Infantry building, which at the time was the New Hanover County Library. But the Wilmington Light Infantry still maintained a room in that building. And in that room was the guns they used in 1898, including the machine gun, which I used to play with when I was a kid. When I'd go to the library and there would be members of the Wilmington Light Infantry in that room or Red Shirt Militia in that room, I would go in there and listen to them talk about 1898 and how they had pulled off the coup and how they had killed hundreds and hundreds of people and how, they had taken over. The words they used was, "We put them niggers in their place."
The Democrats used their power to pass laws that disenfranchised and segregated black people for decades to come. These are more commonly known as Jim Crow laws.
Jim Crow laws, like literacy tests and poll taxes that prevented black people from voting, were immediately enacted, and Wilmington's spirit of black opportunity was crushed. Black political representation in the state was over. It would be 90 years until North Carolina elected its next black Congress member.
The white supremacists also celebrated their victory as a model for other states to follow. The white supremacists who took over the city government not only passed those Jim Crow laws and rewrote the history of the insurrection as a righteous uprising against a corrupt and tyrannical black government, they also erected monuments and named streets and buildings after the coup leaders while erasing or silencing the voices and memories of the victims. Some of the buildings, streets, and monuments created by the Democrats after the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898 were the Waddell Building, a 4-story brick structure that was built in 1901 by Alfred Moore Waddell, the leader of the coup and the self-appointed mayor of Wilmington. The building was located at the corner of Front and Princess Streets and housed Waddell's law office as well as other businesses and offices. The building was demolished in 1971 to make room for a parking lot. The Waddell Memorial Auditorium, a large hall that was built in 1912 by the city of Wilmington to honor Waddell, who died in 1912. The auditorium was located on 3rd Street and hosted various events such as concerts, lectures, and graduations. The auditorium was renovated in 1937 and renamed the Thallian Hall Center for the Performing Arts. It is still in use today as a cultural venue. The Waddell Monument, a bronze statue of Waddell that was erected in 1914 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in front of the New Hanover County Courthouse. The statue depicted Waddell standing on a pedestal, holding a scroll and a sword. The inscription on the pedestal read, "To the memory of Alfred Moore Waddell, soldier, statesman, orator, patriot." The statue was removed in 2020 by county officials amid protests against racial injustice and Confederate symbols. The Manley Street, a street that was named after Alex Manley. The street was renamed 7th Street by the Democrats after the coup and later renamed North 7th Street. It is still in existence today as a residential street. And the 1898 Monument, a memorial that was erected in 2008 by the city of Wilmington to commemorate the victims and survivors of the insurrection. The monument consists of 6 bronze panels that depict scenes from the event, such as the burning of the Daily Record office, the shooting of black residents, and the forced resignation of Fusionist officials. The monument also includes quotes from historical documents and testimonies. The monument is located at 3rd and Davis Streets, near where some of the violence took place. it is still in existence today as a public art piece and an educational resource. These are just some of the buildings, streets, and monuments erected by the Democrats after the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898. They reflect how the white supremacists tried to celebrate their victory and erase or silence the voices and memories of their victims. They also show how some of these symbols have been challenged or changed over time by people who seek to uncover and acknowledge the truth about this event and its aftermath. Just imagine if you were a family member of a victim that stayed in Wilmington, having to walk by or later drive by these monuments to the insurrectionists. How would you feel? The victims of the insurrection suffered a great deal of loss and trauma. Many of them were killed by the white mob, while others were wounded, arrested, or forced to flee from their homes and businesses.
In the process, you had to look at the history of Wilmington. And when you looked at the history of Wilmington, you found out that the town is almost synonymous with racial violence.
The survivors of the insurrection faced a harsh and oppressive regime under the new white supremacist government. They were stripped of their voting and civil rights, segregated from the white population, and subjected to violence and discrimination. Many of them lived in fear and poverty and had little access to education, health care, or justice. Some of them tried to resist or organize against the white supremacy, but faced severe consequences. Others tried to cope or adapt by forming their own institutions, such as churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. The victims of the insurrection were also largely forgotten or ignored by the mainstream history and media for many years. And to add insult to injury, the event was largely covered up or distorted by the white media and historians for many years, until recent efforts to uncover the truth and honor the victims. This stemmed from the actions of the white supremacists who portrayed the event as a race riot caused by the black people. In fact, the truth about the insurrection was not widely known or acknowledged until the late 20th century, when historians and activists began to uncover and expose the facts.
What really brought 1898 out was the Wilmington 10. I don't think if it hadn't been for the Wilmington 10, it would have still been a secret. Because in researching the Wilmington 10, you bump into 1898. You have to bump into 1890.
The victims were finally recognized and honored by various efforts, such as monuments, memorials, documentaries, books, and museums. People reacted to the insurrection in different ways, depending on their race, political affiliation, and location. Here are some of the reactions at that time. 1. The white supremacists who carried out the coup celebrated their victory and claimed that they had saved Wilmington and North Carolina from black domination and corruption. They received support and praise from many white people in the city and the state, as well as from some national newspapers and politicians. They also tried to justify their actions by spreading lies and propaganda about the event, such as calling it a race riot caused by black people. 2. The black residents of Wilmington who survived the massacre were terrified and traumatized by the violence and destruction. Many of them fled from the city, leaving behind their homes and businesses. Some of them sought refuge in nearby towns or counties, while others moved to other states or regions. Those who remained in Wilmington faced a harsh and oppressive regime that stripped them of their rights and dignity. They also faced a media blackout and a historical cover-up that erased or distorted their voices and memories. 3. The fusionist officials who were ousted from power were humiliated and threatened by the white mob. Some of them were forced to sign resignation letters at gunpoint, while others were arrested or exiled. They appealed to the federal government for help, but received no response or intervention. They also tried to expose the truth about the insurrection, but faced censorship and opposition from the white supremacists. They lost their political influence and legitimacy in the state and the nation. 4. The rest of the nation had a mixed reaction to the insurrection, depending on their awareness and perspective of the event. Some people were shocked and outraged by the violence and injustice, while others were indifferent or supportive of the white supremacists. Some newspapers and magazines reported on the event with accuracy and sympathy, while others repeated or endorsed the white supremacist narrative of a race riot. Some activists and organizations denounced and protested against the insurrection, while others remained silent or complicit. These reactions show how the event had a profound impact on Wilmington, North Carolina, and the nation, as well as how it was influenced by racial, political, and social factors. Unfortunately, no one faced any legal consequences for their role in the insurrection. The white supremacists who orchestrated and carried out the coup and the massacre were never arrested, prosecuted, or punished for their crimes. On the contrary, they were celebrated as heroes and rewarded with political power and social prestige. Did the racist white people of the late 19th century and most of the 20th century ever face any real penalties for their actions? Let us know your thoughts on this in the comments. The federal government, led by President William McKinley, a Republican, did not intervene or investigate the insurrection, despite pleas from the ousted fusionist officials in the black community. McKinley was reluctant to confront the white supremacists in North Carolina, as he needed their support for his foreign policy and his re-election campaign. He also feared that sending federal troops to Wilmington would spark another civil war. He ignored or dismissed the reports and evidence of the coup and the massacre and accepted the results of the 1898 election that gave the Democrats control of the state. The lack of consequences for the perpetrators of the insurrection was a grave injustice and a tragic loss for democracy in North Carolina and in the nation. It also set a dangerous precedent for other white supremacist movements and actions in the South and beyond. It took more than a century for the truth about the insurrection to be uncovered and acknowledged, and for the victims to be honored and remembered. The legacy of the insurrection still haunts Wilmington and its people today as they struggle to heal from the wounds of racism and violence. The Wilmington insurrection of 1898 was one of the darkest chapters in American history, but also one of the most important ones to learn from. It was a violent and bloody event that marked a turning point in the history of North Carolina and the United States. It was the result of a white supremacist conspiracy to overthrow the elected biracial government of Wilmington, which was then the largest city in the state and had a thriving black community. And the Wilmington insurrection of 1898 shows how racism, hatred, and fear can lead to violence and injustice, but also how courage, resistance, and solidarity can challenge them. The victims of the insurrection deserve our respect and remembrance. They were brave and resilient people who fought for their rights and dignity in the face of injustice and violence. They were part of the rich and diverse history of Wilmington and North Carolina, and their legacy lives on in their descendants and communities. Their story, despite being buried and forgotten for many years, is now resurfacing, reminding us of the deep scars and wounds that racial inequality has left on the fabric of this nation.
They say the Cape Fear River was full of bloody black bodies that day, that black people couldn't find their way, that black men died from gunshots in their backs, that black women ran to the swamps across the tracks, that very smart and bold black men were put on the train and given a free ride out of town where they were told to remain. They say that the dead bodies were left in the streets. The foul smell was so strong that buzzards circled for weeks, that black babies cried and moaned for their fathers and a bite to eat.
We must remember that these events are not isolated incidents of the past, but part of a broader pattern that reverberates into the present day. The lessons of the Wilmington insurrection of 1898 are a stark reminder that democracy is not self-sustaining, but something that must be actively defended against the forces of oppression and intolerance. It calls upon us to be vigilant against the seductive rhetoric of divisiveness and fear, for those very forces led to the brutality and bloodshed that stained the streets of Wilmington. As we conclude this episode of Illuminating the Shadows of Hidden American History, let this be our pledge to keep the memory of the Wilmington insurrection alive, to remember the lives lost and the bravery shown, and to strive for a future where such acts of racial terror are confined to the history books, never to be repeated. The burden is upon us to learn, educate, and most importantly, act against racial injustice. For it is only by shining a light on these dark chapters of our hidden American history that we can truly understand our present and shape a better, more inclusive future. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the shadows. We hope you've been enlightened, inspired, and most importantly, encouraged to further the dialogue on racial justice. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to Buffy's World for more eye-opening explorations into the hidden narratives of American history. And we'll see you in the next video.